HOA sold off my property. During deployment, I returned with the military and took everything back. I was thousands of miles away, fighting in the desert. When my neighbors decided my land was vacant, the HOA stamped it sold, handed it away like it was nothing. They thought I would never come back. But they forgot one thing. I don't fight my battles alone. Welcome to HOA Secrets Uncovered. I'm David, a veteran who lives in a quiet suburban neighborhood that's not so quiet once the HOA gets involved. By day, I work on cars. By night, I share stories that the HOA never wants you to hear. And today, I'm telling you how a simple power trip turned into a war. HOA sold off my property during deployment. I returned with the military and took everything back. I wasn't supposed to come home like this. Not to a quiet street that hid a storm beneath its fences. Not to a neighborhood where the grass looked perfect. But the people were sharper than barbed wire. I had been gone for months. Maybe years if you counted the way time bends when you're deployed. The desert heat never let up. The sound of helicopters never left my ears. But through it all, I thought about home. My little piece of land. My place to breathe after all the chaos. When I left, I trusted them. The HOA, the neighbors, the so-called community. I thought they would protect it. The same way I was protecting something much bigger overseas. But I was wrong. I came back to find papers, stamps, signatures, a new name on the deed. They called it vacant land. They said I had abandoned it. And they sold it, my land, my home, like it was just another empty parking spot. You don't forget that feeling, the way your stomach drops when you realize everything you built, everything you fought for, is gone. Not stolen in the dead of night by strangers, but taken by people who waved at you when you drove by, smiled at you when you mowed your lawn, people who said they cared about community. While secretly cashing in on it, I stood in front of the lot, where my home once stood. Now a new family unpacked boxes. Children laughed in the yard where I once dreamed of building my future. And there I was, a soldier who fought battles overseas, but had lost the war in my own street. The HOA president didn't even flinch when I confronted her. Her smile was polished, her words rehearsed. "Sir, according to our records, your land was unmaintained. Therefore, the board voted unanimously to reassign it." Unmaintained. That was the word they used. Like sandbags piled high in a foreign country didn't count as maintenance. Like serving on the front lines didn't buy you the right to come home to your own soil. But I kept my voice calm, because calm is scarier than rage. I just nodded. And that was when she laughed. A soft, smug laugh. Like she had won, but she hadn't won. Not yet. See, in the military. We learned something. We learned that a battle isn't just fought with weapons. It's fought with patience, with strategy, with the right people at your side. And that's when I realized this wasn't just about land. This was about principle. This was about teaching a board that thought they were untouchable, that some lines should never be crossed. Days turned into weeks. Every time I walked down that street, I saw those fake smiles, neighbors who avoided eye contact, board members who whispered behind closed doors. They thought I would fold, that I would pack my things, disappear quietly. But soldiers don't disappear. We return. And when we return, we don't come back alone. One call was all it took. One call to the people who had my back when bullets flew and bombs fell. Men and women who didn't forget what loyalty meant. They stood by me in the desert, and they were ready to stand by me in suburbia. But before that call, I had to decide, do I fight this battle the normal way, with lawyers, courts, paperwork stacked to the ceiling, or do I remind them that some battles aren't fought in quiet offices? They're fought on the streets, on the very ground they tried to take from me. And so I made my choice, because sometimes revenge is best served by compliance, and sometimes It's best served with boots hitting the pavement. The HOA didn't see it coming. They thought I was just another homeowner. But I wasn't just a homeowner, I was a soldier. And I wasn't about to let them rewrite the rules of my life the night before I made the call. I walked the block. I saw the glowing windows, the trimmed hedges, the flags waving from porches. It all looked so normal, so peaceful. But I knew what it really was, a stage set for pettiness. A curtain hiding corruption, a place where one board thought they had more power than the Constitution itself. I stood there in silence, breathing heavy, listening to the faint buzz of streetlights, and I smiled to myself, because I knew something they didn't know, something that would shake this neighborhood to its core. So I ask you, if your HOA sold your land while you were away, would you fight them in court? Or would you take back everything they stole? The way I did, I thought I knew my neighborhood, the quiet lawns, the trimmed bushes, the perfect driveways. But when you look closer, when you really watch, you see the cracks, the way Mrs. Gardner stares from behind her blinds every morning, the way the HOA president's smile lingers too long, like she's measuring your worth, the way neighbors whisper when you walk by. It's not a community. It's a stage, and the board. They were the directors. They always said it was about standards, the right shade of paint for your door, the right height for your grass, the right mailbox approved by the board. It sounded harmless, like they just wanted order. But I had seen order before, and this wasn't order. This was control. The rules weren't about beauty. They were about power. They weren't written for fairness. They were written to remind us who was in charge. And the worst part? Everyone pretended they didn't notice. They just smiled, signed their checks, paid the fines, and called it normal. But I had lived too long in places where control meant survival. I knew the look in their eyes, that sharp glint of someone who enjoyed holding your fate in their hands. And I wasn't about to bow to them, the president. Her name was Linda. Short hair, expensive glasses, the kind of person who called herself professional. But behind that glass smile was steel. She liked the power. She liked that every mailbox, every flower bed, every crack in a driveway had to pass through her approval. And selling my land wasn't just about money. It was about a message. It was about reminding everyone that if she could do it to me, she could do it to anyone. I still remember the meeting. I walked into the clubhouse. The air smelled like coffee and paper. Neighbors sat in folding chairs, whispering like school children. And at the front, Linda sat with her board. 4 members, 4 shadows who nodded whenever she spoke, like puppets tied to her strings when I stood up to speak. The room fell quiet. I told them what they did, how they sold my land while I was overseas, how they thought I wouldn't return. Linda leaned back in her chair, folded her hands, and smiled. Sir, the decision was unanimous. She didn't even blink, like my home was just a line in her notes. That was the moment I understood. This wasn't just about me. This was about everyone in that room. They were afraid of her, afraid of fines, of threats, of legal letters, afraid of losing their homes. The couple fined for flowers that weren't approved colors. The elderly man whose fence was torn down by order of the board. The family forced to sell after the HOA piled thousands in maintenance charges. Every story was the same, abuse disguised as order, control disguised as community, and the more I listened, the more I realized this wasn't just my battle, it was everyone's, but not everyone was ready to fight. Some closed the door when they saw me, some lowered their voices. Scared the board might hear, fear had poisoned this neighborhood. Fear was how Linda kept her throne, and then it happened. The board sent me a letter, big red stamp on the front, final notice. Inside was a single line. Any further presence on the property will be considered trespassing. Trespassing. On my own land, they weren't just taking my property, they were trying to erase me. That was the breaking point. That was the spark that lit the fire. Because they didn't realize who I was. They didn't realize what happens when you push someone too far. I made the call that night, not to a lawyer, but to a friend I served with overseas. His voice was steady on the other end of the line. "Tell me when," he said. No hesitation, no questions, because loyalty doesn't need an explanation. The next morning, I stood outside the clubhouse again. I watched as board members filed in for their meeting, Linda in her crisp blazer, the others trailing behind her like shadows. I didn't go inside. I didn't need to. I just stood there, waiting, letting them see me. Because sometimes silence is its own weapon. And when Linda finally looked at me, I smiled. Not the smile of a neighbor, not the smile of a victim, but the smile of someone who knew exactly what was coming. Days turned to nights. The neighborhood stayed quiet, too quiet. But beneath that quiet, tension was building. Neighbors whispered when I walked by. The board tried to act confident, but I could see the flicker in their eyes. They knew I wasn't playing by their rules anymore, and that terrified them, because for the first time, someone wasn't afraid. And that's when I started to wonder, what happens when a neighborhood ruled by fear suddenly finds courage? What happens when one board loses the grip it's held for years? And more importantly, what happens when the soldier they underestimated comes back, not alone, but with an army at his side? The first sign of war wasn't soldiers at my side. It was paper. White envelopes slid under my door. Letters stamped in bold red ink. Violation. Warning. Final notice. Each one colder than the last. Each one sharper than a blade. The HOA thought they could bury me under paperwork, that if they sent enough letters, I would break, that I would bow my head, sign their checks, and vanish quietly. But every letter they sent only made me stronger, because I knew fear was their weapon, and I refused to hold it. Linda signed every one of them with that same neat pen stroke, her name curling at the bottom like a brand. She wanted me to see it, to know it was her hand pushing me out, her way of saying, "I own you." But she didn't own me, not anymore. Neighbors started watching closer now when I walked down the street. Blinds twitched open, curtains shifted. Some faces looked guilty, others curious, some even hopeful, as if they were waiting to see what I would do, because deep down, they wanted someone to fight for them too. And the board? They doubled down. They hired a lawyer, a man in a pressed suit with a face that looked like it had never cracked a smile. He sent me a packet thick as a brick, pages and pages of threats. Charge. But when those doors opened, and they saw what stood outside, their power cracked like glass. It wasn't an army with rifles or tanks. It was something more terrifying. It was presence, uniforms sharp, backs straight, faces unshaken, brothers and sisters who had stood with me under fire, now standing with me in suburbia. The HOA built their strength on fear. But fear changes sides when the right people walk in. Linda's face went pale the second she saw them, her lips pressed together. Her fingers tightened on her papers for the first time. Her voice shook when she spoke. "What is this? This is harassment. This is intimidation." But I didn't say a word. I just looked at her, steady, calm. Because silence has a weight all its own. The neighbors poured into the street. They weren't whispering anymore. They weren't hiding behind blinds. They were watching, waiting, some with fear, some with hope. For years they had lived under the shadow of fines and threats. Now they saw something different. They saw the shadow fighting back. The board tried to retreat into their rules. The lawyer shuffled his papers, quoting lines about jurisdiction and community order. But every word sounded smaller, weaker, because no bylaw can stand against loyalty. No paper can outmatch presence. I stepped forward. The gravel crunched under my boots, and every pair of eyes followed me. For a moment, the street was silent. Even the wind seemed to stop. And then I spoke. This land was never vacant. It was stolen while I was serving my country. And now, we are repossessing what was mine. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Neighbors turned to one another, voices rising. The word repossess hung in the air like smoke. The board froze. Because suddenly the script was no longer theirs to read. It was mine. The soldiers didn't shout, they didn't argue. They moved with precision. They stood on the sidewalks, lined the property, formed a wall no one could cross, not violent, not aggressive, just present, and presence was more than enough. Linda tried to regain control. She raised her voice, tried to shout over the crowd, "You can't do this! You can't just walk in here like you own the place!" But that was the problem. They had walked over my life like they owned it, and now the tables had turned. I watched her tremble. The woman who had smiled at every meeting, the woman who had signed her name on every threat, now hiding behind her board like a child. Because power is easy when no one challenges it. But when the challenge finally comes, power slips like sand through your hands. The lawyer tried again. "This is illegal. This is trespassing. You'll regret this." But the neighbors didn't believe him anymore. They had seen too many fines, too many threats, too many lives ruined by pieces of paper. And now, for the first time, they saw someone stand up against it. And it made them wonder, if one man could fight back, maybe they could too. That was when the whispers started, not in fear, but in courage. A neighbor stepped forward, told her story out loud, how the board fined her $3,000 for a cracked driveway. Another man shouted from across the street about being forced to replace his fence twice in a year. Each voice made the board smaller. Each confession made the soldiers stronger, because the board fed on silence, and silence was gone. I could see it in their eyes now. The fear wasn't in the neighbors anymore. It was in the board, in Linda, in the shadows who had nodded at her every word. They looked trapped, cornered by the very people they had controlled. The line had shifted, the balance was gone, and they knew it. I turned to the neighbors, held their eyes one by one, and I said, "They sold what was never theirs. They called my land vacant while I was serving this country, and if they can do it to me, they can do it to any of you." The silence that followed was heavy, thick, electric. Then came the first cheer, then another, then a wave of voices rising louder than any rulebook. The street that had once been quiet with fear now roared with defiance. Linda stepped back, her papers trembling in her hands, her perfect smile shattered, and for the first time, she looked small. The board had built their power on the illusion of control, but illusions vanish when the truth stands tall in front of them. And now the truth stood in boots and uniforms, unshaken, unbroken, unstoppable. I knew this was only the beginning. The fight wasn't over, but the tide had turned. The board had felt fear for the first time, and fear changes everything. The board thought it was a show of strength, that the uniforms were just for intimidation. But they didn't understand. This wasn't for show. This was repossession. The soldiers moved like clockwork. No shouting, no chaos, just quiet precision. They spread through the subdivision, marking boundaries, documenting every inch of what the HOA claimed to own. Clipboards replaced rifles, pens replaced bullets. But the message was louder than any gunfire I had ever heard. This was order, not theirs, but mine. Neighbors crowded around, whispers turning into shouts. Every family had a story. Every voice added weight. The board sat frozen inside their clubhouse, watching the ground shift under their feet. Linda clutched her binder like it was a shield, but no binder could protect her now. I walked straight to the center of the clubhouse. My boots echoed on the polished tile. The board members shrank back in their chairs, and Linda finally found her voice. "You can't do this. You don't have the authority." But she stopped when she saw the soldiers lay documents on the table, pages stamped and signed, orders that carried more weight than her bylaws ever could, because what she forgot was that I wasn't just a homeowner, I was still military, and when a soldier's rights are violated, it doesn't end in silence, it escalates to the very top. The orders placed their so-called subdivision assets under review, Clubhouse, maintenance equipment, community signage, even the HOA's own office, all frozen until further notice, in one sweep. The board lost control of everything they used to control us. The look on Linda's face was something I'll never forget. Her smile cracked. Her voice stammered. Her hands shook as she tried to gather her papers. The queen of the neighborhood reduced to a cornered pawn. And the neighbors, they saw it, for the first time. They saw that she wasn't untouchable. She was just another woman hiding behind rules she didn't even write herself. And that was the twist they never expected. They sold my land, so I took their kingdom. The clubhouse doors were thrown open, neighbors poured in, voices rising louder than I had ever heard, one by one. They spoke out, stories of fines that had broken their savings, stories of threats that had kept them awake at night, stories of humiliation handed down in neatly folded letters. It wasn't just me anymore, it was all of us. The soldiers didn't have to say a word. They just stood there. Silent witnesses, proof that the tide had turned. Every voice was a nail in the coffin of the board's power. Every confession a strike of justice. Linda tried to silence them, banging her gavel, shouting, "Order! Order!" But order was gone. Her kingdom of silence had collapsed into noise she couldn't control, and she realized, maybe for the first time, that she was finished. The lawyer shuffled his papers, eyes darting nervously. He knew too well what those stamped orders meant. He knew the ground had shifted beyond his control. And when lawyers lose their confidence, you know the end is near. The neighbors started chanting. Not my name, not the soldiers, but one word: justice, justice, justice. The walls shook with their voices, the same walls that had once echoed only with fear. I turned back to Linda. I leaned close so only she could hear. "You wanted to take my land. Now watch as I take everything you built on lies." Her eyes widened, her lips trembled, and in that moment, the mask finally fell. She wasn't a queen. She was just a bully who had run out of pawns. By the end of that day, the subdivision was unrecognizable, not because of bulldozers or chaos, but because the people had finally stood. Neighbors who once whispered now spoke loudly. Families who once paid silently now demanded answers. The air was heavy, not with fear, but with freedom. The HOA board wasn't dissolved yet. That battle was still to come. But their power was gone, their signatures worthless, their threats empty, because they had broken the wrong soldier, and soldiers don't just fight back. They finish what they start. And as the sun set over the street, the same street that once felt like a prison, I stood tall, knowing this wasn't just about land anymore. This was about justice. Justice for me, justice for everyone, but the question still burned in my mind. And maybe in yours too. The street looked different the next morning. Not because the houses had changed, not because the fences were taller, but because the fear was gone. For years, the HOA ruled with letters and fines. For years, neighbors whispered instead of speaking. But now, the whispers had turned into voices, and voices are louder than any gavel. The clubhouse doors stayed shut that morning. Linda didn't show her face. The board members vanished behind curtains. Their little empire was cracking, not with fire or fists, but with truth. I walked the block in silence, every step heavy with the weight of what had happened. Neighbors came out slowly, first one, then another, smiling at me in a way they never had before, not the fake smiles they gave the board, not the scared smiles they gave each other, but real ones that carried relief, gratitude, courage. Mrs. Gardner, the woman who had once watched me from behind her blinds, stepped forward with tears in her eyes. She told me how the board fined her for planting roses without approval, how she almost sold her home because she couldn't afford the penalties. Her voice shook as she spoke. But she wasn't whispering anymore. She was free. Others followed. One by one they came to me with their stories, and with every confession, The grip of the HOA weakened further. It wasn't just my fight anymore, it was ours. That night the board called another meeting. They thought they could regain control, pull their strings, scare us back into silence. But when they opened the doors of the clubhouse, the sight waiting inside froze them in place. The room was packed, not with fear, not with quiet submission, but with neighbors, standing shoulder to shoulder, filling every seat, every corner, every space, and at the front. I stood waiting. Linda tried to speak. She raised her gavel, tapped it against the desk, but the sound was drowned by the voices of the people, the very people she thought she owned. "Resign!" someone shouted, then another, and soon the room thundered with demands. Her eyes darted, her hands trembled. For the first time, she had no control. The lawyer tried to step in, muttering about procedures and bylaws, but the neighbors laughed at the same rules that had once crushed them, because once the curtain falls, the illusion is gone, and so the board fell. One by one they resigned, not out of honor, not out of dignity, but out of fear of the people they once silenced, fear of the truth they could no longer bury. Linda was the last to go, her glasses tilted, her papers scattered. She tried to leave with her head high, but the crowd didn't let her. Not with violence, not with hate, but with the weight of their eyes, every gaze reminding her of what she had done. Every silence louder than words. She left that night without a crown, without a throne, just another neighbor stripped of power. And when the dust settled, the subdivision was finally ours again. We didn't celebrate with fireworks or parades. We celebrated with laughter, with relief, with peace. Children rode bikes down the street without parents watching nervously. Families sat on porches without fear of letters arriving in the mail. For the first time, the neighborhood felt like home. I stood at the edge of my land, the place they once called vacant, the place they tried to erase from me, and I planted my boots into the soil. It wasn't just land anymore. It was a symbol, a reminder that no board, no bully, no bylaw could take away what was truly mine. And as the sun dipped below the rooftops, I thought about everything that had happened, about the silence that once ruled, about the voices that had risen, about the fear that had turned into courage. And I knew one thing for certain. Justice doesn't always come easy. Sometimes it takes patience, sometimes it takes loyalty, and sometimes it takes reminding the powerful that their rules mean nothing without our silence. The HOA thought they could bury me, but instead, they buried themselves. And from that ruin, a community was reborn. I turned to the neighbors gathered around me, their faces lit with hope, their voices alive with freedom, and I asked them a question that maybe I should ask you too. When power is abused, when rules are twisted, when silence is demanded, would you stand with the crowd and stay quiet? Or would you be the one to rise and turn whispers into thunder?